Okay then. Well, thank you both for coming here today. And the main reason I've invited you here is to discuss the practice within this exhibition that I've put on. And initially to talk about material languages. And as a guide, I've sort of said, is it that material practice has an explicit and legitimate language that speaks to the viewer? And does this work on different levels of sensorial experience, or does this language resist analysis? That's quite a big question. I'm fully aware of that, but I'm trying to articulate what it is that the materials do and how they speak. And we know that things like lipsticks and the cosmetics that I choose to use are very much about sensuality and desire, and it's also about transformations, and it's quite a transient thing. So I consider the language in that way, that it comes from the materials. Do you agree that that works, and how do you think that that articulates what's happening in the work?
I've been thinking about the little bit how your materiality activates, what makes it active or dynamic in some way. And I think it comes from the fact, as you mentioned, for example, lipstick or tattooing or even sticking something on the body. Mm-hmm. It's always in relation to a flesh, or it's with the flesh that it kind of happens. And it's, so when you're speaking, I feel like when you speak about, and I feel that, because I'm not sure if that's correct or not correct, but it's just kind of the gut feeling that there is your materiality is already in a relationship with something. So it's never singular per se, it's a tension and dynamics of the relationship that creates the matter and meaning of that thing that you produce, or that thing that kind of comes out of your work. And as such, it's kind of sometimes very difficult to think materially when we're actually thinking about dynamism and about multiplicity and not singularity from the get-go. But we're thinking about that relationship as a thing to begin with that doesn't really have a shape, doesn't really have that is not really material. But it materializes. It makes itself known. It makes itself visible. It makes itself potent of some way. Potent is a weird word.
I like the word.
It's a weird word, I think. But I was thinking like how that mattering of some sort, so like this, it's hard to describe this kind of dynamics makes sense and it kind of makes artwork in some way. And like that was a kind of my first thinking about what do we mean when we say materiality or materialism of any sorts. And I kind of continue to kind of like thinking through back your practice and knowing what you do. It's always like this kind of, but it's not really a thing that you're referring to when you say matter. It's actually referring to dynamics, to multiplicity. And by referring it to a matter, you kind of you both take away the singularity of materiality as commonly kind of known, and at the same time applying this kind of, but it behaves just like a matter, or can be a matter. It's like this kind of shapeless blob of some way. I don't want to say that, but like, you know, yeah, sorry.
Because I think also, I mean, choosing the materials that I do that are so closely linked with the body, or the processes that I use, such as tattooing, like you say, it's all about the flesh, it's all about the body. But I very much try and avoid having, the struggles I had when a body appeared in the work. Do you think it's that the materials are enough to suggest that corporeality? Or do you think there's another level that we need to be considering? around that, because I think a lot of it is within that materiality, even though I agree with you that when you're talking about matter, it can operate in a very different way, and it's about how you approach the work, and it's not always explicit what's happening in the work, and sometimes you do need little pointers or reminders to fully appreciate what's happening. And I like that subtlety about it, and the fact that the work can still stand up as a formal thing without having to know what those materials are. So it's almost about the formal qualities as well.
Is process also part of that material language?
I think process is a really important part of it. I don't think...
So that's also entangled into that. Into that space.
And that hands-on managing materials, you don't normally get lipstick is just normally a small sort of cigarette size thing, and when you're working with it on the scale that I have done in the pieces here, you think about it in a very different way, and you deal and manage it in a very different way to how you just apply it to the body. But the body still comes back to the material. It feels like that you can't separate the materials that I choose to use away from the body.
Yeah. There's something about that lipstick piece though. The lipstick is a makeup item. Makeup activates because of heat or warmth of the body. It becomes a foundation, becomes an eyeshadow, not eyeshadow, but everything that has oils in it basically, like lipstick. It activates because it touches the heat. It becomes like, that's where the smoothness of its application comes in. It suddenly glides across the lips. It kind of blends into the skin, and like I'm thinking how, without that heat, without that warmth, although that warmth comes in because of your touch or like your kind of your body contact with it, so you're involving that heat, but you're putting it, you kind of, instead of on oneself, you're kind of just deploying it out there in some way, and then this kind of the surface starts to be this waxed, lipsticky, glossy, not really, but kind of glossy surface is there, and it and I'm kind of thinking, what are the conditions for it to sustain itself? What are the kind of how you keep it alive in some way, because if the sun shines on it, it's going to melt down. How does it operate with the primer, if it's on the canvas or if it's on the board, or how is it kind of so then the heat is still there, this kind of contact heat, which is the thing required between lipstick and the body for it to activate. So you're activating it, but through touch, through that kind of putting it out there, and then painting it on the surface, creating this kind of waxy thing, which by that you're removing the body from it in some way. You're kind of leaving the reminder of the body, but it's not but it's not completely present. It's not represented clearly that it's...
So it comes back to that thing as well, I guess, about the absences of the body as well, and having to acknowledge that absence, which we still have looking at me from behind.
The actual body.
An actual body,
I feel bad that I disrupted your practice that way.
But that's been a really interesting thing, and I think we'll come back to that conversation again. I think when we're talking about the formal qualities of the work and the material, that there was maybe a suggestion of a body or a hint of a body, but you have to acknowledge that body's not there anymore. But then does the viewer become that body? Because I find with a lot of these works, it is the viewer becomes quite performative.
Yeah, they want to touch.
Yeah, yeah.
With that comes trace.
And activates the work in a different way, so that those materials start to travel, they start to move, they start to be uncontrollable.
Activates experience as well.
Yes, like that's so gorgeously played on the viewer. Like, you know, remove the body, but at the same time kind of demand the body for it to work.
And that is part of it. It does, I think, demand that physicality and that the understanding.
The viewer becomes almost like phantoms walking in and out from it. They go away, they come back.
And this is sort of what I'm curious about, is how well it activates for different people, because we understand the work. Do you think that works for people who maybe don't understand it quite as well?
I think the way that you've constructed your lipstick piece in particular, in its size, its bed shape, you have that, or you would be able to look at it and understand that you're inferring a bed. And in that sense, there's something that is, a bed is quite transient. People go in, people lie down, people have sex, people read, people chuck them out. It's quite a throwaway item in that sense as well.
Well, so, people are born and they die in beds, you know, and I think sort of the symbol...
People do makeup on beds.
Yeah, the symbol of a bed is so loaded in some respects, because we all have that experience of being in a bed, maybe having sex or reading a book or just having a lie-in, and it's like then seeing how a viewer responds when they actually realise that that's what's going on, because I don't always think it's particularly immediate when a viewer confronts the work. I don't think it's always obvious about what I'm trying to get them to, about what I'm trying to get them to do, but somehow they do it, and I'm trying to understand why. And I know it's really quite complex understanding how a material language activates and whether it can have its own speech. You know, I sort of say that the language I choose because of is materiality, and then because of the materials I choose, that language becomes about the body. And it is very much about the corporeal, which is why in some ways I'm really pleased that these pieces have become and they have arrived, because then it's sort of, by bringing the body in, it does make it more obvious that that is sort of maybe where the work is situated.
There's also for example, with the tattoo on the body, in the body, in the body, not on the body, because the stickers go on the body, that goes in the body, literally, literally under the skin, with heavy metal. And also not your hand tattooed this. It wasn't you doing it. You provided a file, like, you know, that if we kind of reconstruct it to the basic, like, kind of elements, how did that arrive in the place that it arrived in? It was a conversation, then it led to the question, then to the file being sent, digital file being sent, then to me finding a tattoo artist, then to actually establishing a date for it, sitting down, lying down, giggling, because it's in a tickling part of the body, which I always find reminded every time I look at it. I remember the giggle I had, and the guy shouting at me not to move too much. I have tickles, and I didn't realize that it's actually there's like, I think it's around the top of the G, where the heart and the G kind of comes in. It's like a spot that when the machine was vibrating, it was like it went all over my body, and I was like, hee. And you can't move. You shouldn't move if you want to have a clean, like if you want to get it done. But there is something about like how all those steps, how far they removed are from what you usually would do with a piece in some way. And the meaning of the piece, how completely, like, it has really different meaning for me. The gay has a really different meaning for me than it has for you. And yet at the same time, the word gay is a word in common for us. Weirdly enough, it brings commonality rather than differences, even though it has completely different attitude in its articulation. And that's what I kind of wanted to, I think, broaden. That's what it was on the way here. I was kind of struggling to figure out the word for it, and then I kind of, it's the articulation, right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about language, and you mentioned just now speech, that's not writing necessarily. That's not putting text onto something. That's not using texture. It's a certain form of bodily way of using
it's a
text.
process as well.
It's a process. It has saliva in it. It has throat in it. It has a kind of
it has
wobbles.
air. It breathes.
But yeah, it's still a material, sure.
It's still material as well, and I think that always that reminds me very much of how cinema works, right? How the moving image especially with people in it, works, because you have the mention of a body, or you have a sound of the body, or even songs work that way. You know, you have a body present, but you don't see the body very often, but yet you can see a body. This kind of way, and I think the same thing happens when you think about your bed. It's like it brings things in common, even though it has completely different meanings between everybody surrounding it.
Yeah.
So the bed is almost commonality, but not universal. It's the commonality that brings people in on the thing, but then everybody has a very different experience of a bed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they just throw those experiences on it because they hear bed, they go for it. They see gay, they go for it. They throw their associations, and most of them in a positive way, of course, and stuff like that. But maybe there are some negative emotional attachments to it as well. But all those associations go in, but you're creating opportunity for those commonalities of differences to occur. It's kind of, that's what you're trying to. I think that's the way you're interacting with the audience, and you demand the body. It's this throwing something to them, to people, to get them something in common, and at the same time that commonality is what reveals or talks about the differences, or it kind of allows for the speech of difference to occur without hierarchy, without kind of forms of materializing what's good, what's bad, what's correct, what's incorrect. All those kind of questions, binaries, things just don't really matter. It's the way that it not structures, but destabilizes, and at the same time stabilizes the people around it. I think that's what works, and that's how you partially.
And this is something that I think we will come back to again, because I know I'm interested in that difference between how we experience gay. But what do you think the materials are doing? Because they're quite naughty. They're quite uncontrollable. They have their own life, and they can extend beyond the object that they exist on, and they will continue to
unfold,
to spread and to smear and to go on, but it actually leaves the work damaged or marked or altered in some way. So by people experiencing that, they actually damage it. Now, I don't object to that. I must admit, I do prefer to look at it when it's beautifully smooth and I haven't got any fingerprints or any marks or any bird marks. We have birds in the gallery. But other than that, I like to think of the idea that, as with the transfers, people can take these works away with them. That is more explicit in the way that it operates, but we saw a little bit earlier when we were setting up some of the problems that can be caused with powders and glitters that are in a space. And how do you feel about sort of activating the work in that way? Because it is activating it is using another person to develop that work in a different way. Do you think that's right? And how do you feel about it if it's you that is carrying that work away with you? And at this point, I'm not talking about the tattoo, because I think that is a very different conversation.
I think it fractures the typical hierarchy of an art gallery and the way that art tends to operate. You can't touch here, you can't touch there, you know. And with that, I think when it comes back to the idea of bodies, and it's something that I think is probably quite important because it becomes transient. And yeah, with that, yeah.
Okay. Should we leave it at that for that point, and we'll have a quick break at 16:09, and then we'll have a look at the next one we're talking about, which is when we'll start talking about gayness.
Sorry, I'm laughing. Every time I hear the word gay, I want to laugh. Especially with you. I don't know why. that should be...
Well, I always...
joyous.
Does anybody need a break at this point? I'm saying that just so that we can mark it on the film footage.
Okay.
I'm fine.
But if you're okay
to
to
be
carry
directed.
on... Because it does pick up on what we were just talking about, and we talk about material languages. However, in a more formal sense, and using the noun gay as opposed to the word gay, what does that represent when regarding social norms, status and transgression? And I think we both bring all three of us bring very different notions to that idea of what gay is, which, to be honest, must be the same for everyone. Everyone is going to bring their own version to it, but I appreciate that my version and Jakob's version is completely different.
No.
But my version of gay is always assumed to be the same version as yours.
As in homosexuality, like gay men,
Yeah,
most of the
yeah.
time gay.
And I think people... I was having a conversation with a student the other day, and I introduced myself, and I always feel that I have to introduce myself as gay place rather than gay, because it sort of helps set a context. And this young man was just laughing, but I allowed him to, because he's got to get it out of his system. And I did have to stand there and go, yep, it's a stupid name. Yep.
It's not stupid.
But
don't call it stupid.
It's what my parents called me, and I'm married to Mr. Place. This is how it is. What is your issue? What I really want to ask people is, what is your issue with it?
I mean, I love the fact that you use heteronormative relationship to arrive at gay place. Like, just as a sentence even, that's just fabulously poetic thing. And I think for me, giggling when I hear gay place, or like when I see gay and I think about my gay and your gay and just the gay in general, in this relationship created through this tattoo, for me, it's a smile and it's a giggle, but it's not giggle that is judgmental or anything. For me, it arrives at this level of queer fabulosity
Yeah.
that only people who do not find forms of normativity, only people who understand how normative power works, know how to transgress it without. It's a form of transgression that is not standing on the opposition. It's a form of transgression that kind of blows the bubble in the system. You know, it kind of develops a small, tiny reality of joy and excitement and fabulosity. That's all like you know, that's the kind of words that come in to describe it in my head, and that revokes in me laughter, because it's a laughter of joy, and it's a laughter of like how fabulous the world can be, and like how fabulous those lyrical plays and the way things turning out to be. Is it purposeful? Is it unpurposeful? Is it like kind of catching something and being birth and like kind of taking it with you and like going with it? That doesn't necessarily matter. It's what kind of happens in the interactions, and like later on it becomes a new materiality, new form of networking that just exists, and it doesn't ask for permission to exist. It doesn't disallow permission to exist. It doesn't stand in opposition. It just kind of is.
It just is.
And then not in the purest form, like it is, so it is, not the kind of God purist thing, but like it materialized. It exists because in some way you as an artist somewhere there consciously turn it around to make it happen. But at the same time, some of those bubbles, I know like probably they are not predictable necessarily for you. But you noticing them and kind of gathering them into this project, like kind of what. I don't know how to describe
That's
it.
quite
kind
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I know
it's a
we're talking
recognition
about
of something
language
happening.
and we're trying to understand, but we're all quite physical people, and I think this is, we understand that.
Your name has been very much a journey, though, hasn't it?
Yeah.
In the sense of how you were born gay, then changed your name through a historical period, and I'm aware that there was, problems around your name at a particular time, which is when you changed to Soul. Is that right?
Yeah.
So there's this journey that's gone on, and then you have reclaimed it back to you. For your identity, because it's, as you say, it's different for Jakob and it's different for you. Is that something as well that you think needs to be spoken about within your project, your thesis, in the sense of its historic provenance on where you've got to, especially with your pieces as well?
I think I need to bring it into it, and I'm glad that you said reclaiming, because that is what it was about when I decided to use that name again, and using it in the context that I was given that name when I was a child. And I think, yes, it's very different for myself and Jakob and how we use it, but I think in reclaiming it, I sort of thought, I take a lot of pleasure from it. Somebody asked me the other day, do you like your name? Are you proud of your name? And I was like, yes, I am, because it puts me in a position where I still can't speak for other people, but I can come at it from a different angle, and I can have an empathy and an alliance with a queer community, and they embrace that with me. You know, I mean, I am I loved that point in a book that we've all read, and I can't remember
which one. We don't know.
But where she states, you know, I am a 50-year-old, I think she was 40 at the time, I'm a 50-year-old woman, I'm in a heterosexual relationship, I'm middle-aged, where does this come from? And a lot of it has come from that sort of personal thing I had with the struggles I had with living with that as a name, and then also the decision to go back to it as well, and being able to embrace that as quite a joyous and celebratory moment in my life. And I know that's nothing near about sort of if you're coming out as queer to family or to friends, things like that, because it is so much different. I still don't have to justify myself or my sexuality. It's just assumed.
Yeah, but it's not just like kind of, it's not about differences in experiences.
No.
Yeah. It's not about bringing, oh, one is worse, second is better. It's about like the way queer community took on the word queer, because we're speaking more about queer rather than gay as a terminology, and how it redeployed it to reinforce the importance and to kind of realize, like, to literally break that kind of there's nothing wrong with being queer is fabulous, to redeploy it like that, to kind of use it, then to actually use it in a critical theory, to call queer theory, to use it as such, which doesn't really exist, but it does exist because people write about it.
Yeah.
All those movements are very much part in some way. You recognize, and you see, that's why I was talking about recognition. You recognize those happening as well, and that's where the moment of recognition, especially with the gay, I would assume, it's like you find the finding of it, recognition of it, like kind of bringing it into oneself, or like bringing it here closer, you know, somewhere more at the arm's reach, so you can grab it and redeploy it, or like grab it and do something with. So it becomes your network. It's not there is no like, it's not about comparison. Is it worse? Is it better? Is it like more? You know, what's the experience like? Because that's so based on individual person and how they decide to live, how they decide to kind of come out, or they live their life, or what the kind of way, what the social parameters they operated, what's their speech, can they speak, you know, can they come out, is that even a thing possible? So, you know, all those things don't really, it's not about, as I was saying, kind of hierarchically putting them together.
No.
It's about the recognition and like finding oneself in parallel to the line that is there drawn. It kind of allows you to learn and allows you to kind of inhabit something, which is fabulous, to be able to inhabit that and grab onto it and kind of create a nook for oneself that one can, as I said, grab something from and redeploy it and grab something.
I mean, I almost
onto.
sort of consider it in some ways that when I changed my name, I was avoiding that queerness.
Yeah.
And by reclaiming gay as a name, having to acknowledge there is an inherent queerness within that.
Yep.
And sort of accepting that places me in a queer situation, which queer communities can understand so much better, I think, than the heteronormative sort of people that you're normally coming across, because there are so many times when I see looks of disapproval or
Do you laugh?
just yes, generally,
Oh.
because I do treat it with a lot of fun. You know, gay is a fun word. It is, as Jakob says, it's truly fabulous, and I think being able to retain that and engage with that is so much more about me. And I found it quite interesting that when I was setting up the place, I was here when I was setting up the show, and I think I said to Yaz, what's been really odd is like it's almost like I've moved home. I've had to bring all my queerness out of my house and present it in this space, but yet I still want it to be domestic because it's what I live with. It is how I operate. It is what I am. It is what I'm interested in. And I did feel almost bereft, and I do miss some of these pieces when I'm at home now, because
There's an attachment.
there's a queer element that is missing within my home that is all residing here. So I'm almost asking myself, is this what my queerness is? I guess it is, isn't it?
Parts of it. You still go home and you're still gay. Like,
Yes.
you understand?
Yes.
So
yeah.
it doesn't, it becomes like a,
It is a way of life, isn't it?
Almost a
You can't
boil.
just be.
yeah.
I mean, if you aren't offended by this comment, I would class you as on a queer.
I've classed myself as a demi-gendered person, so my gender is in flux at the moment in the sense of how I identify, and that's something I'm still very much
Yeah.
investigating. I was just thinking as you were talking about, you said in the previous question about how your artwork operates in this kind of formal space of a gallery, and with that, correct me if I'm wrong, there's like a binary element to the way that an art gallery operates, and with you're talking about something that sits outside of that, in the sense of things should be touched, things should be explored. You know, there shouldn't be a rule to say no to something. So there's these kinds of connections with the way that the manifestation of gay, of queer, and how that operates within the idea of how things are activated. And you're talking, you know, even with your tattoo piece, the bed. I think also you talk about spaces in particular. Like you've taken your studio and plonked it into an art gallery setting. That's also fracturing that as well, because somebody's coming into your space. So that's also like a dwelling in oneself, and you've taken that out, and that's your queerness too.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
That's kind of good. That's really beautiful. The way you
It is
phrased
quite beautifully said.
So
And there's something you also like. I was when you were saying about people might touch it or like move it around or like smudge it and things, and I was thinking, and there was this thing in my head, like in the background, being like, okay, yeah, like that's what will happen. Like you can't, and by accident or purpose, you know, all those like you kind of can't really figure it out. Like you know, don't touch without saying don't touch it.
Well, I think. Sorry, carry on.
No, just like, and it kind of made me think. I went back to the thing that at the beginning I was talking about. It's the materiality is the relationship, not the singular thing that one arrives at or one comes from, or something comes from or arrives at. Materiality is that dynamics, and if we're talking about how you're deploying your body to activate the lipstick to become a painting in some way, and like that relationship, body lipstick, this is a very singular relationship because it's much more complicated, much more bigger than just those two things. I'm just using those two things to kind of simplify idea rather than so please expand it. It needs to be expanded on rather than because there's warmth and there's like all the other things, but like let's simplify it for the purpose of this conversation. If those two things come in a relationship and they produce the painting, or they kind of arrive at the painting, that dynamics arrives at the painting, it doesn't mean that it arrives at the painting. It arrives at the moment where, let's say, audiences interact with it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really, it never kind of materializes as a whole, as a everything. Like never.
it continues, doesn't it?
Just, so it started with not a singular shape. It has iterations that it goes through, that one can say, oh, this is something like a this is this exhibition, for example, is just an iteration. I'm not
Yes.
saying just to remove the significance of it or to kind of problematize it through it. I say just iteration because it's one of many that happens. And this painting was on shown many different times.
Yes.
And I also mentioned here that we need to remember every time we iterate our work, let's say in a presentation, so we show it as a digital image on a screen, or we speak to our students, saying students
Yeah.
because we kind of all operate in a higher
Yeah,
education
yeah,
setting,
yeah.
or like teaching setting. But when we kind of talk about works, how they operate in that as well, because those are also iterations. When you
Yeah.
speak about your work, even now this conversation
It's
becomes the
another
iteration
yeah.
of the thing. It has different contexts always and kind of finds its setting, but all those things just add up and they continuously add up and they never arrive at the sum of things. It just is about this adding up of things and not arriving at conclusion of it and like not saying, oh, this is it, I finished the piece, is, even though we do that, we all arrive at the thing saying like, oh, the piece is finished, but we all know the finishedness is from, it's more about our attention to the piece.
At that point in
Yeah.
time.
We
Yeah.
let go of the attention to some way as a kind of one who participates in making of it, and then kind of lets it go, not in a way I let it go, now be with the people. Like,
Yeah, out in the world.
No, oh, no, but it's like it dusts up in the corner of our house. It's rolled up between our wardrobes. It's under
Yeah.
the bed where
Yeah.
it hasn't seen the sunlight in 20 years. Or it's in the gallery, or it's in the back of our cars.
Other
Or
manifestations, yeah.
it becomes this talk about artist, part of artist talk. All those things, even as we let go of the attention or like kind of participation of it, like clear focus, visible participation, it kind of stays on, hangs on, and kind of still is dynamic.
And I think
yeah.
what I like about it is we've all been to galleries. We all know you're not meant to touch things or move things or whatever. And I don't know about you two, but the more I'm told not to, the more I do. And I think in this instance, with the materials that I choose to use, it then becomes problematic for the viewer. With other pieces, it doesn't have the same consequences, perhaps. You know, something, you might leave a fingerprint on it, but it's not as visible as, say, marking a surface or moving powders or whatever. So I think I don't necessarily encourage that thing, but I think everybody does it in one way or another, and I think it's those little moments when people have touched it thinking that it is stable, that it is secure, and then suddenly realising that it isn't, and hoping that they've got a little bit of
You on them.
yeah, and taking a little bit of me and my work with them, and in the same instance maybe feeling a little bit awkward about it because they know what they've done. A little bit like when people laugh when I introduce myself.
Yeah.
Sensation.
And I think that is, I mean, that might bring us onto the next one quite nicely. Because when I first began this project, I found the concept of the post-human particularly intriguing, as you both know. However, as a theoretical background for this project, I don't think it fits. I don't think it works. I believe the material practice has got a critical framework within identity theories, queer theory, looking at lived experience and phenomenology and sort of thinking around that sort of thing. That is where my head is at with it. And I think I came to that conclusion because so many of the ideas of post-human sort of seem to suggest that human beings won't exist, and that's just so not going to happen. We are sensual beings, and we exist because of that sensuality and how we engage with the world through our senses, whether it's sort of quite literal visually, or whether it's on a more intimate sort of physical, corporeal level, which is why I've sort of dismissed that idea of the post-human. Are there any other strategies you think you guys bring to it within your own way of thinking? Because I know you've both got different interests. What frameworks do you approach these works with, do you think?
One thing about post-human that I always kind of how I read it and how I deploy it, because again, this is, I don't think I get it necessarily right, as I like, you know, I get it, don't get it right, but the way I think about it, it's, I always kind of remind myself, it's the decentering of human as an experience of something. So when we speak about looking at something, we speaking about our sensuality, human sensuality of experiencing sight and seeing something, and how, for example, that gets disrupted. So meaning, how would photography, for example, look if the, and this is going to sound silly, so please don't hope nobody who listens to post-human is going to kind of bite my head off, but like how dolphin would take a photograph, you know, it's and actually realizing that maybe the human-centric way of seeing in this case is not, maybe should be not set aside, but decentralized, meaning it's non-hierarchical, so it's kind of removing of that hierarchy of some way. And it's also, the second part of it is this acknowledging human technology interaction, the cyborgian kind of post-human, the thing that the way we're looking through the lens of something already attached. At this moment, we can, especially in technologically developed countries, in the West, you know, everything is framed within a lens of a phone and a kind of device. So it's never, especially after pandemic even, you know, everything is literally framed through digitized and redigitized to feed into senses of humans. So suddenly we are not using our senses, we are not deploying our senses in a way that what makes us purest human. We are very post-human now. Like as a kind of humans, we are not humans anymore in some ways, because we are already, and I'm going to go back to it, like in the relationship with something. We are not disrupted. And it's also about ecology and how we like actually interact with it, and what are our responsibilities as a human, because centering human experiences devalues global ecological disaster that has been happening for so many years and decades, like hundreds of years, and what's been leading to what we're experiencing now. And decentering human maybe would allow like humans who are in some way centralized to it, so this kind of way backwards, to realize like it might be better to step away from it, like to kind of allow things to be a little bit more, in order to kind of not just use this framework that exists within human body as a correct way. It's just a way,
a different way.
Exactly. So that's always I thinking about post-human, what it means to me. I've been like doing lots of work with snails. Like I've been thinking about snails. I've been thinking through snails.
Amazing.
It's not, I'm not trying to become a snail, although kind of, but rather I try to think like not, I call it more poetic of a snail, because I'm not actually going into like what's the slippery thing made of chemically, or how the shell is being, well, I read a little bit, but like I'm not going into how the shell is made. It's rather the kind of how human interaction with the snail created this poetic way of us now thinking about snails. They're slow, they're slimy, they don't have sex, but they perform sex. Also, or they have both sexes, or I wouldn't use hermaphroditism here because it's more intricate when it comes to snail. And more beautiful, not more beautiful, it's so intriguing when snails mate. They sometimes hang, that's so cute. They make a dangling thing. That's not a dangling. I'm just like, la 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 la. Anyway, so lots of this kind of cuteness almost to it, but also kind of comes, so I'm using that. And I'm thinking with your work, there's something in relation to thinking of poetics of kind of quantum queer feminism,
Yes.
Karen Barad and so on, would maybe be beneficial. And I mean, I think what mainly for me, and I'm kind of coming back to what, I've been kind of repeating that because in my head I try to figure it out as well. So I've been repeating that with hopes that something will come out that makes sense. But there is, Karen Barad writes about the priori, the way we recognize the history, the way we kind of speak history, the way we kind of talk about linearity of time, and she kind of talks about this kind of
time isn't linear.
Yeah, time isn't linear. So she talks about non priori, this thing that you can't go back to the beginning. You are in superposition, like the thing you are wandering around is the superposition. So it's the crossing of the waves measured by a certain apparatus. Yeah, that's the reality, and going through agento realism, that's how she calls it, but that is never, that just exists within those parameters, but it can exist very differently in different parameters. It can materialize very differently in other parameters. Doesn't mean one is right, one is not. It just means that it creates coexisting realities of thought, of practice, of making, that just coexist, and you can't return to, it started with me taking a cable and plugging into the wall. That's something, that's a description of action, like ethnography and something, which is great, but it still doesn't capture exactly what was happening in that moment. And the way we measure it, it's like, because it's a human hand touching the flag, we have allowance of electricity in the space, this diffracted even further. So I always thought that would be a good idea to kind of think about it. Just have it as a backdrop of something.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I was quite curious about when we were talking about sort of dealing with technology and everything else, for me, it was quite important that there was still a physical manifestation of the work, and that is experienced by the viewer through different senses. So there might be smell, there might be sound, you might touch something, you might feel something, and that language can't operate in the same way when you present that work technologically. So then it's about the language again, coming back to the language that you use to articulate the ideas that you're trying to express. But I'm always interested, I think, I'm thinking about this, and then I don't know if you've come across Joanna Frew, who talks about an erotic sensibility in sort of thinking and writing and how that is performed, and I sort of am interested in that as a concept because I think some people bring that to their work. I think some people can't deal with that in the same way. They may be more reserved or don't know how to express themselves. Perhaps that's not necessarily right. But I still want people to be able to have an experience in a physical way rather than just that digital thing. And like I say, it really bothered me over lockdown that there wasn't any work that you couldn't go, you couldn't spend time with objects and things, and I think a lot of people missed out on that. You know, we talk about the hugs and all the rest of it, and we know that emotionally and physically how important that was, but then there were also other things that weren't being stimulated within that sensory understanding, and I think that is what has been missed in the work, and that's why I think it's important that there is that physical presence, if you know what I mean. I'm just talking through something there that I'm not.
It's like an intangible language through the encounter.
Yeah, and
so
I think that is what this whole conversation is
so
about.
it's thinking more in the sense of like Barbara Bolt, which like, and that material intelligence, so just actually thinking about stuff and those nuances when you just thinking back to lipstick when you're spreading it, and those events while you're doing those little nuances, and those moments are trapped within that piece, and how you articulate that either through this conversation or through writing or filming or it's like there's stuff that I've been reading at the moment, part of Japanese culture, they have a language that about materiality that is unspoken, and they use that.
And it's almost intuitive, and
yes.
Yeah.
But Barbara Bolt does it quite clinically when she explores that material intelligence, doesn't she? Yeah. You know, David Hockney was one of the examples, and you know, she's actually painting that, you know, particularly setting things up in certain ways. But I also think it's something that you can't necessarily replicate, because everybody and the way you do something might be quite different anyway. So, and materials have their own way of presenting something, you know, depending on, you know, temperature, light, you know.
Well, they'll do things that sometimes we don't expect.
And within that becomes a non-linear journey when it comes to your making and the way that it's presented and the way it's received. So,
and within those sort of strategies, I also like things like the Deleuze and Guattari sort of rhizomatic idea, where things just spread out rather than there being that linear sort of chronological progression. It can spread, it can be different, it can move around.
Which goes back to your idea around quantum.
It's kind of that's why I'm saying like poetics of quantum. I call it poetics of quantum. I don't know if, because I don't know quantum physics. I'm not trained in quantum physics and never claim to be. No. But there's a certain way, especially Karen Barad writes about it, the way she writes about it. There's something beyond. It's not just about what she says, it's the way she says it that actually allows people, like not only allows people who might not have, don't have a backdrop of knowledge of quantum physics to kind of
really hone in.
To be able to still understand.
But, you know, the way she kind of writes it, she allows for, this is what, like when you read, let's say Deleuze, do you actually read Deleuze, the word by word, and gather the meaning from what is being said? Or are you reading it, it goes over your head, you feel, this is super confusing and fucked up, sorry for swearing, or some things stay in your head, some things kind of go off. And you realize, maybe to realize, is to kind of get to know that that's fine. Like that is reading as well. Which means that is language as well, which means, and by the way, Deleuze was doing that purposefully, like that's, you know, the way, like he just liked doing it for some reason. He loved throwing at ideas and never answering what it was, just like made your head spin.
But I think, just as an aside to that, I do think it's quite interesting, because even though you leave the work of Deleuze and you think, oh my god, my brains are going to fall out of my ears, you are absorbing it. you don't, and I don't think you always realise that immediately, but it is going in, it is having an impact somewhere, even if you think it is just melting your brain. And I think that's quite interesting, that you absorb this language visually and you're not aware of it immediately. A bit like having a tattoo, I guess.
Yeah, it kind of, it's about finding a way. So the language, if we're speaking about language in your work in some way, there is of course connotation of how you're using language and how you're deploying words, phrases, titles of the songs, names, dates, everything else, how that is being deployed as a form of communication, right? And like to bring Deleuze back in, like Deleuze always said like art is not about communication, like he just disassociated those two. But he said art doesn't have something to do. That was like he was having a lecture for, I think, cinema people, filmmakers, and I was listening to that lecture because one sentence always stayed with me, and I don't know why. But he was saying art is not communication, first of all, but art has something to do with act of resistance. What exactly has to do with it, he doesn't know. And end of conversation. Great, you made it happen.
Why we
you
love
said
it.
something and you never explained it. However, I always kind of find that this kind of act of resistance, what he means, and he of course he refers historically to like Holocaust and denial of the Holocaust and stuff like that, especially in the UK, for example, at the time. So he kind of refers to a certain what happened to the language in a certain time, historical time, and why the act of like how the language in the acts of resistance, what that was doing, something else that normal communicative language doesn't do necessarily, that allow for him to think that this thing is art, like that would be art as such, not the communication, not the come join us here is the arrow, but the I always think back to the kind of gay liberation in America and ACT UP and stuff like that, how the transformation of the triangle, all those little bits and pieces, how the quilt that covered the Washington monument, around the Washington Monument, like all that makes me think art, but not art what it was, but what it was doing. It was act of resistance, but not act of resistance. It was protest, it was kind of all those things, but at the same time it was language that didn't fit in. That didn't conform to the function of the language. It functioned differently. It allowed for things to emerge. It allowed for things to kind of bubble up. It allowed for unsureness, unendings, beginnings, noodle points, noodle. We should call it noodle points. No,
I like noodle points.
But like things to happen around it and with it that doesn't really say this is beginning, this is the end, this is the story, this is narration, this is what happened when I did this piece. It's like kind of, instead it allows you to, for experiences, for sensuality, for all those things that are so important in your, as you say, so important in your practice, to be present within that language as well, without describing it, but actually allow for it to be there as well. So like for Deleuze, confusion was very important, and his language is confusing. Like one cannot be disassociated from the other. He performs his practice with his writing. And I think it's finding that moment, especially practice-led research. It's like, that's like golden. I can't do it still. I'm still wondering how the fuck to do it. But I think that's kind of
it's
finding
like
of it.
Recently I'm having to approach my writing as just another level of practice rather than seeing it as academic writing, because otherwise it becomes quite intimidating. It can be quite scary. And I guess this will bring me on to a final point, which I think we should also discuss as well, because I think we all do it where we use material languages, self-reference and reflexivity within our practices. All of us do. And I think it's very easy to be accused of navel gazing
Right.
and things like that whilst you're within this process. I mean, Jakob in particular, how have you negotiated that? Or did you not?
Okay, so for context, for people who don't know, I doing my PhD, there was a lot of photographs of myself.
Yeah.
I was taking myself in my own space of home, and that was the kind of also context of my research, partially. And also I was talking about posthuman, for example, because I developed what I called intimate relationship with my camera. And I also ate with it, and I kind of slept with it, and I also kind of took pictures of it with it. So the me-camera relationship became just domestic environment, part of domestic dynamic environment, which sounds fabulous and interesting. It's lots of poetic writing, kind of trying to phrase simple things in very difficult way in order to continuously disrupt them, because it's I like doing that, unraveling things. But there was a problem, the problem of I, and this kind of the whole, oh no, don't say I in academic writing. It's like, bullshit, right I.
Yeah.
You did it. I kind of have a...
Artwork is quite personal,
Yeah.
and when you engage, particularly when you engage with the making on the level that we do, you do become part of the work, and it becomes part of you. And I'm with you in that it can be quite difficult to negotiate how you get around that. I mean, I can't ignore the fact that I am all over that work.
Yeah.
And people will look at it, and yes, it is transgressive, and it is a little bit questionable in some respects as to what I'm trying to achieve, but it is also quite a serious sort of consideration of gayness and why would you mark a body in that way? You know, I mean, I've had mine done, you've got yours, we're still waiting for Yaz, but I'll give her a little bit of time,
There's all has been a campaign to get Yaz to get tattooed.
I will.
No.
And no, I'm not trying to coerce you, I am teasing you.
That's terrible.
But I do just think that once you bring that level of the self into a project like this, you just have to be so careful about how you expose yourself as well.
I think that's the problem. Not problem, but something that you need to negotiate with yourself. And it doesn't mean, you can be as explosive as you want to be in your writing. If this is literally argument for yourself necessary, not necessary for academic, achieving PhD as such. Because I know many people who doing the PhD, and they, especially in social sciences, where they use autoethnography as a method, they reveal a lot about themselves, about the personal lives, personal struggles that led them to the research, and also that led them through the research, and the new experiences that went within that research. All that, and it's beautiful, it's great to experience, but you need to negotiate if this is what is comfortable. If this is actually healthy, maybe it's healthy. Not everybody will have a different way. I think the problem becomes when you start to think that you have to. You don't have to if you don't want to. You don't have to share anything personal if you don't want to, because it's your personal. And that doesn't have to. I was told off actually a few times for sharing too much personal shit when it comes to my practice. And not told off necessarily because I shared it. It was what's the purpose of it? How does it fit in? Does it make sense to be there?
Does it
actually
that level?
It's not. If I'm talking about quantum, let's say I was talking about posthuman and stuff like that, and one of the pieces I always describe it. I made it. It was a photograph of pages of the gift of death from Derrida. I couldn't read it because Derrida. So I pulled the pages out, literally put them in the water, and I stuck them on my face, and I took the picture of it on my phone because I couldn't get, like, you can't see, and that was like a very spontaneous act. And as I was putting it on, my mother called, and I was speaking to my mother about some family stuff, and I had this gift of death on the phone with my mother, trying to wait for the cold water dripping on me, and like, you know, trying to figure out how do I speak through the layers of pages on my face. And I tell that, and that for me, that never made to my thesis, that story, for example, because it didn't really, not that it didn't matter, it mattered very much, and for me it's like one of the best experiences I had making artworks, best interesting experiences making art, but at the same time it was like fun experiences, fun story. It's a fun story for me now. It didn't really affect the research, like it didn't spoke to the research necessarily. It didn't change something in my work, or it didn't resist. It kind of went with it. And if it didn't resist, or if it doesn't kind of problematize something, like actually invoked a way of thinking about something, then why does it need to be there?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, like, does it really do
lack
something?
of waffle.
Yeah.
But then it's like, I think this piece that we've talked about quite a bit, that actually came about through a personal thing where we go on holidays and my husband says, I'm going to get a tattoo. So I said, get my name tattooed. And he was really resistant to the idea. And I completely understand that. I get that. Yeah. So for you to have done that, in a way that my husband wouldn't, you know, it speaks on a different level that communicates something else about that lived experience for both of us, I think, about, and again, we've touched on it before, the different reasons that we have this tattoo and why it's come about and how it's developed, and it is about those different iterations of it as well, because we know we're walking around with them, they exist with us all the time. I can put those away in a drawer, I can box those up and put those away, but the two that we have,
well, you can still remove it. Like, tattoo is not no more permanent, basically. Like, you know, we can, like, it's not permanency. I think it has something to do with, you know, lived experience is important there, and like identity politics and the actual language of identity politics, it's particularly important in that piece, because it kind of takes it, plays with it, slightly embraces it and changes it.
Because I think if it didn't have a capital G, it would read differently.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Completely.
I mean, when people see it on me, they think it's a gay tattoo because I'm gay, and I'm just that gay that I would tattoo myself with the word gay on me, which is interesting because first of all they kind of assume gay to be an identity when we're talking about sexual sexuality. So, you know, there's the whole thing about, like, you know, when homosexuality became a species in like 20th century. I love psychoanalysis. They just like didn't screw us up at all. Nobody, like, they just like screwed up. But anyway, so, you know, but there is something about identity. There isn't something about identity there. But I wear it partially because I have it done. Partially because I'm gay. Partially because you're gay. Partially because I know you. Partially because I saw it and I was like, I could die to have it tattooed on me. Like, there's deliciousness to that piece, as the simplicity, the joy of it, the heart, the gay, the way it's the usage of the font you use, like, just visually, even is visually and not visually, just it made me adored it. Like it's an adored thing, and I was thinking, and it's this water ball tattoo. Like you had the sticker tattoo thing. At the time you were doing the machine thing. I think you were repairing machine after first show or something like that was happening, and I was like, oh, I would love to have that tattoo. Like actually have it body like inserted, because it's a little bit cheesy, a little bit kind of like an old. It's kind of heritage tattoo type, where you put name of your lover in your heart, like it has all those connotations to it,
and that was all quite intentional.
And
this is
when you were doing it,
a tattoo I designed for my husband to have on his arm, knowing that he would never have it.
Exactly, and all those things, and I was like, I would really like to have it tattooed, and partially because I'm gay, partially because what your language game you played with doing that.
Yeah.
Such a great idea, such a simple great idea, but it's a good idea there, and a very interesting idea, and I kind of every time I see it and read it, I always remind myself of what's the whole thing, interaction, the whole what gay is this, where that gay lies, and the fact that because it's like on different bodies, like not even on mine, but like on different bodies now, and it's repeated, and is it sticker or not sticker, is it like design, is it digital file, is it like actual tattoo, like all those iterations of it, it's like it literally dismantles what is gay, and both what is gay me gay as a sexual identity, and both is what is gay you gay and your lived experience with that name on, and it kind of dismantles it, not necessarily makes it unimportant, it kind of diffracts it basically, but and brings it back together into new shape, new whole, new thing.
It's a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah, so I felt like it does that, I think, but it's not, it's partially because identity, it's partially because of your name, partially because of personal history, partially because how current language operates, partially because of how we find our nodes and spaces. But anyway, I just kind of really like.
It's quite a multifaceted piece.
Quite multi-layered. I see it
especially like with Jakob saying around the identity, but also because you both have got it, but you both had different artists that tattooed it onto your body. So it's like it changes.
And also, I mean, that lived experience of having the tattoo done brings another layer again, and like you say, using different tattoo artists, my tattoo is very different to yours, which I'm a little bit disappointed about. I think yours is better, but I'll let it go. I might get mine retouched at some point.
Well, mine is hairy now, which is very weird, because that's shaven. Jakub is not shaven no more. Jakub stopped shaving.
But again, that's quite interesting because that changes that idea of the work. Again.
And it faded because it's red.
Yes, and I've got a couple of patches on mine where the colour's not quite held. And the only other sort of one I'm interested in with that is when I first changed my name, my brother-in-law is called Gary. And he got really disappointed because he was like, there's only one letter between us. Because he's Gary Place. So I've got to convince him.
Gary Place.
Because he is gay as well.
Place.
And it's just adorable.
Cute.
There's nothing wrong with Apple being cute, by the way. Like, I kind of, like when people say, it reminds me of kitsch. And this is also why I think looking into expressions of queer and like how that became a thing, especially in that piece. I'm not saying that this piece is queer because it speaks about identity. I think it expresses similar thing that the queer people
that the idea of queer is. And I think that's quite an interesting point actually, that you separate that idea of it being queer and it being about identity as well.
I mean, sometimes I used to love that separation. I used to say we need to, not need to, but I love thinking queer beyond the identity politics, as I used to say.
Absolutely, because it is.
Which is great. But I want, I always remember, I want to rephrase that, I think, especially in the current kind of political climate, and you know, I remind myself the feminists, the person is political. I kind of go back to it, and I literally remind it sometimes to myself as a mantra, trying to keep it in mind as I do things and think things. I remind myself that, and I think it's thinking queer, not beyond, but also outside of identity politics. It's like to add to it.
Yeah.
Because if I say beyond, I feel like it creates hierarchy. I feel like it might do. And I don't think it should. Like, I think it's the one thing that queer does well. It's the removal of hierarchies. Or tries not to do hierarchical things.
Is Viva really as horrible as it sounds?
No, it is. No, it's not. I don't know.
It's 10 times worse, no.
Well, I know people had terrible experiences sometimes, and I know I think I had a good experience, partially, mostly, good experience. I thought Viva was going well, but I think the biggest thing was articulating what I did, because I didn't get it clear enough in my writing. I think what's the contribution to knowledge.
But you're writing in a second language as well.
Yeah, but that you see, that is not an excuse. Unfortunately, no, it's not necessarily an excuse. It can be excuse. It's not necessary excuse. I think I got confused about a lot about how it should be written and what it should be doing, and I overcomplicated things a lot in my writing unnecessarily. So there are chunks of my thesis, full chapters that it can live without, I feel, and the things that I would like to write differently, slightly.
But I would imagine if you did your PhD again, you would approach it very differently. Anyway, now with hindsight
and time,
yeah.
I would do what Mattia did now, which is he wrote the full thesis, even though it was practice-led thesis. So he kind of argued, part of his argument was that it's this writing, reading, the experience of all that things, the seminars, the journey, all this was practice, and he used that as a framework for his as the practice, even though he wrote the full 80,000, 90,000, something like that.
Which is a great framework to think of everything as material.
Well, again, when I'm writing, I've sort of managed to shift my head a little bit to see that as an extension of my practice rather than something that has to be done to justify it almost. And I think that is what you get a lot with writing about art before this point, is you're writing it just to justify it for yourself and for other people, whereas this writing is part of it, whereas before I think I was writing it very separate, treating it as a separate entity and not part of the work. And I think once it becomes part of the work, it does make a big.
Why did you make that separation?
It's made a big difference to me.
Can I ask why do you think that separation existed to begin with?
I don't know whether it's all the sort of things you do when you go through sort of BA and your masters, and you are asked to comment on your work, justify it, explain what it's about, why you're doing it, how it's developed, and so you develop this quite particular way of writing about your work that is quite separate from the practice, whereas now it's like it has to be part of it, because if it isn't, it's not going to make any sense.
Correct me if I'm wrong in the sense of the Viva and the element of new knowledge. If there is something within your PhD journey when you are finding out something, if something is not finite, that can be spoken about too. So in the sense of like the work, as you say, is continuous, and with that, there needs to be an articulation around that. So I suppose don't be worried in the sense of something, you don't have to be as finite or as, oh, this is it. Because I suppose you could potentially talk about how you might take it further, even after.
Well, yeah, because also I will be talking about iterations in the work and how
which is
they
one of your
exist
frameworks,
in different ways. And that will continue. And you know, I mean, I'm working on other pieces as we speak. I've just got to prioritise the writing, but there's still other pieces that are coming out of this and that will continue to be developed from this.
So in academia there is actual framework for that, like this kind of what's going to happen next, and it's clearly articulated in like REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework around impact. But there is an actual encouragement, at least I when I was doing my PhD I was taught that there is this encouragement that you write about how your work might be deployed in the future, what it actually, and it's partially because it shows potential of the work, or rather it shows that the work has can do something, but it actually what it actually does, it situates it in the field of knowledge. So it does the same work as what literature review would be, meaning. Again, literature review, it's a very dry concept, but we always should think of it as where your work sits within something that already exists, because we don't start from nothing. It's always already somewhere attached to something. So as such, it kind of, this ending almost element saying, oh, it can be picked up and spoken like this about, or it can fit into this, or it can go there, it can go to Boston. Right, to Boston, who knows? But I might get legs to go to Boston. So so that kind of becomes it's a way of situating it again at the end. So there isn't actual thing like it's a good idea to write in your thesis
where you think
where do you think it might sit, and it's not finished, it requires more research, like even that magic sentence. But also new knowledge thing, it might not be what you're actually thinking you're doing. You need to be in some way open, just as you are open with your artwork to something happening, you need to be open with that as well. Because my new knowledge, in theory, has nothing to do with the palimpsestuousness, even though that's the kind of what many people assume my knowledge comes from. I actually reiterated that palimpsestuous. Many people some of my supervisors still think I invented that word, and I was like, no, I did not invent it, and I repeat that continuously throughout my thesis to make sure that it's not bad, that people know that I didn't invent that word, or kind of came out. However, I expand on the meaning of it and deployed it in a fine art context, because it's never been actually deployed in a fine art research kind of field. So that's part of the new knowledge, that it's actually being deployed that way. But the other one was actually around Foucault, and the new around Foucault to speak about his conceptual framework of heterotopia, of subjugated knowledge, and of parrhesia, which is truth telling. Parrhesia, I cannot pronounce it. That's why I write about it. But because I use those frameworks to speak about my practice, by which I actually deployed philosophical concepts of social interaction or social kind of power relations in relation to the homoerotic queer art practice. And that was the new knowledge. That was the kind of the actual crack in the thing, because but I didn't spoke about it that much or as such, but what emerged from my research as this kind of new knowledge. But I arrived at it right at the end. I literally wrote it, one of the last things I wrote in my...
Well, it's like when I was talking recently about it, and they were saying, well, your contribution is all in the practice. That is what your contribution is. But then it's still understanding what that contribution is, and sort of the conclusion I'm coming to is it is about material languages and that sensual sort of understanding that I think has a commonality through humankind, really.
Yeah.
You don't have to be queer to understand that language. You just may not read it in the same way. And that's sort of where I'm heading. But this is why I needed this conversation, was to help define that language that doesn't have a language, that doesn't have words. It has actions, it has smells, it has different things going on, and it's actually been able to write that down and explain that, express that.
Won't
yeah,
it?
yeah.
But even what you're saying right now, that is your thesis. Like you saying it's about language that is not
that has no words.
That has no words. That needs the way of expressing certain sensual experiences through, and that explanation becomes your thesis as well. So even those little bits and bobs sometimes we say to explain our research doesn't mean you have to inhabit that explanation in your text. You can just explain it as well. There's nothing wrong with just explaining. It's not going to sound super poetic. It's not going to kind of gravitate, but it's going to actually tell people, oh, this is where we at. Like, this is where we at. This is where we are at the journey, and this is where we can go from here.
Yeah, and it's not an end point. It's not a finite sort of
it's just where you
thing.
Are. Yeah. But there is something, I don't know if you read Lisa Methral, who works at PCU, but she wrote, she published last year article in a book chapter on werewolves.
On what? Sorry.
Werewolves.
But
she talks about this moment when it's like, we're talking about coming out as a form of articulation of self, and then she talks about, hang on a minute, when you're queer. So let's say you don't actually fit into the what already been very recognizable molds of multiple identities. This articulation gets interrupted. It gets stuck. She says it gets stuck in your throat. Like you can't say it.
Yeah.
So she uses example of like the being human and like the werewolf guy who can't articulate. Like he comes out as a werewolf to his family. The scene, which is like normal set, like perfectly normative narrative at this point, and yet he can't articulate it, like because he's he needs to change into the werewolf, and so the living in the identity of changing into something, or like being in the changing doesn't allow you to articulate it, the change itself, because it literally physically stops you from doing it, because she talks about how he's transforming into a wolf. He doesn't speak as a wolf, right? The wolf codes don't do human, so that even that transformation doesn't allow him to actually say it, and it's not. It doesn't allow him out of fear, out of mistrust, out of social politics. It actually it's impossible to articulate. It's an impossibility. You can't arrive at articulation, yet it makes sense. Like it is material. He's changing into the werewolf. It makes sense. It has a there is a process, there is a capture of the process, there's so many things happening that actually are material, yet it cannot be articulated because it's physically like you can't say it. And it's not I can't say it because I'm scared because of this, that those things of course come in when you think about identity politics, but it actually is just that thing cannot materialize per se.
That language.
That language.
It reminds me of Irigaray and the idea around silence. So in the sense of, she obviously talks about the masculinized language and how silence is very much an oppressive, but actually she turns it round and says, actually silence is within. And within you can heal yourself from those nuances in the body. So that, yeah,
And I think silence can have a lot
Yeah.
of power in
Yeah.
its own right.
yes, there's a lovely chapter in a book called Teaching, and the way it's written, you can really understand it. And she uses the idea around the breath and yoga and the hum, and how it becomes really close within. You take that back away with you. Yeah.
Yeah, Lucy Irigaray would
Yeah.
be a great
Yeah.
thing to go through, I think.
And the idea around touching, but touching oneself to understand oneself or to understand your surroundings.
So that helps explain that sort of lived experience and that sort of reflexivity that a lot of us have in our practice anyway, I guess.
Yeah, in some way, but it also allows, like, let's just kind of remember that reflexivity doesn't. How to say it? It's allowing for it to be critical. So don't not to be not to, like, when you focus on the personal, like kind of my reflexivity of a thing while I'm doing a thing. It's great, and it provides you with such a body of knowledge in some way, or experiences, or sensual knowing in some way, or ways of articulating that sensual knowing. At the same time, it should be critical, so it means it actually does things as well.
Yeah.
This practice of reflexivity, it doesn't just and I mean, I hate using just, and I use it so often, but it doesn't situates your practice in a comfortable setting in order for it to be consumed, because that's language and that's communication, right? Going back to that resistance, it disrupts and disorganizes, but at the same time clarifies. Because weirdly, just because we're using terms like disorientation, for example, interruptions, all those terms that in a very heteronormative setting, or like kind of normative any normative knowledge setting, or causality based setting, those are like no-nos, right?
Yeah,
because
it'd be
they
chaos.
do something wrong.
Yeah.
At the same time, those things produce things as well. They make sense. They kind of the chaos, right? It creates meaning and sense through its kind of iterations, through its kind of happening. But that meaning and sense, the point comes when there's judgment attached to it, because it becomes judgmentally looked at as less than the normative linear and stuff like that. And it's about also recognizing that it's not that. It's not like the hierarchy needs to be disrupted there too. You need to kind of, this is bubble, but not closed bubble, but this is something, and that how it operates, without saying completely. There is a text, Ken Queer Theory, there is a journal, I don't remember, I think Feminist and Queer Studies journal, which it was like 2011, I think, where it's like, can queer theory exist without antinormativity, without being referred to antinormativity? Can it sustain itself as a field of knowledge or as something, right, without continuously saying, this
as an opposition,
which is very interesting, because it's very hard to find queer writers who do not find the way to oppose something, like to this kind of, it's very, and it's not as a, I think it's actually kind of beauty of this kind of opposition that performs very well in a queer setting, in a kind of queer field. But there is kind of question, do you have to oppose something constantly, or do you kind of sit yourself
like
in a place?
Irigaray
does that. You sit down in your
it's
place.
It's okay, but here I am, and I go in and I go out.
I go in, exactly. And it's like, that's such a perfect Irigaray, like, this is the place, this is where I'm at. It doesn't mean I don't need to give you power over what you already have over me, to continuously refer back to you in order to tell you how wrong you are. Because that also is form of giving power there, and a form of kind of interruption. So it's about acknowledging that and finding your sense where you are. Because that's the difference between your masters and BA and PhD. You have frameworks for BA and masters because it's taught So you're being told, you're being
How
taught.
to think about it,
With PhD, you create your framework. Unfortunately, it's there is a administration attached to it right now, which is its own kind of thing to discover and to learn about, I think. But that was the most polite way of saying it I could master. But it can be negative. Some people find it very positive and good experience. So it also depends on who's doing the PhD. But PhD, that's why it's such a push towards methodology. You design how you know. You design how you do, but it just needs to have this rigor, like they call it rigor as well. But it does have to have rigor, but it doesn't mean you can't even question how the rigor function, because you are just
making that
designing
inquiry.
your own universe in which things work, and just continue designing.